everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with my co-host Thomas D. House for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is an associate professor of history and American studies at York St. John University in the United Kingdom. He has written, I believe, a couple books on the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And he is going to talk to us today about the legacy of Ronald Reagan. I'm talking about Dr. James Cooper. James, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Well, it's great having you on. I wanted to start with kind of a light, though fairly broad question before I turn you over to Thomas, who is way smarter than I am and asks more intelligent questions. One of my all-time favorite Saturday Night Live sketches, I believe it was from 1986, had Phil Hartman portraying Reagan as this doddering, grandfatherly figure in public. But then as soon as he's behind closed doors with his cabinet secretaries, he turns into this cutthroat, commanding figure who knows everything and is barking orders at everyone. I know you're familiar with the skit, James, because I watched a little bit of an old interview with you where you referenced it. And you seem to kind of allude to the idea that there may have actually been some truth to that portrayal, and that Reagan was, either both of those people, or maybe that he had this politically helpful public persona that didn't quite line up with, how he governed. Does that sound right, or did I misinterpret your view?
I think you're right. I hope I'm right. Other people may disagree, but I think I come to that view because I find Ronald Reagan quite hard to pin down and get to know him. Who was this guy? So when you kind of go through either reading what people have written about him, or look at the primary source of the documents, the meetings, and so on, it's quite difficult to kind of capture who was Ronald Reagan. I think someone once said that Reagan only ever had one real friend, and he married her in Nancy. So that maybe speaks to like the distance he had from people. But I think that clip really shows, in some ways, what his proponents and his opponents would say about Reagan. So his opponents would say, "Oh, he's just this kind of like old grandfather type figure who wants to congratulate the Girl Scout cookie bestseller, doesn't really know what's going on, letting other people do all the thing." A bit like when Tip O'Neill said he'd make a very good king, that type of thing. Whereas his proponents would say actually he does know what's going on, that Reagan is actually a very effective executive. And I think he was both. I don't think he was necessarily the mastermind speaking in multiple languages at all hours of the night, but I think he was definitely the guy who knew where he wanted to go and would say, I want to achieve this. How do we get there? But also knew how to manage people and run. So from his history of being the chair of the Screen Actors Guild, and also being the governor of California, we kind of had a sense of how things work and operate, and he knew he didn't have to be the expert in all things. They just maybe the vision is what matters. So for me, it just sums up both both sides say about Reagan. I think actually it is who he was. He was both. He could be the actor politician who could say, put on a performance and a show, depending on what was required, but also he could run an effective administration.
Yeah, I think the acting background is sort of key to that, and I think you're right. That's sort of how I view this thing too. But I used to read stories about how, and I'm sure you ran into this too, James. How he used to, when he'd go out to is a Marine One, is that the helicopter? He would kind of make this big show how he couldn't hear what questions reporters were asking him about controversial things that were going on, but that was apparently an acting job as well. He was able to hear them, just sort of playing it off like he could. So I think he was aware of how he came across in public, and I suspect it probably wasn't the same. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Thomas here for some questions. Go ahead, Thomas.
I'm really glad you said that, because I love that skit on SNL. But I'm always afraid to show people that skit because I don't want to spread the false notion that he was a simpleton. Because I've come over time. I'm not an expert like you about his biography, but my own assessment, just of what I know, is that he was a very wise person with good judgment, and he was very competent at what he was doing. That's why when some people say like maybe Nixon or Clinton are the most intelligent presidents recently or something, I say they might have probably beat Reagan on an IQ test, but they weren't. I don't think they were as wise as Reagan. Like I think Reagan really had quite a bit of political wisdom. Um, but about that, um, what about this? Remember the with his whole, there's this whole thing that Reagan, one of his strengths was what he was able to do rhetorically during the last years of the Cold War to kind of throw the Soviets off. Do you have anything to say about that when he announced the Star Wars program? What his role was in that, or do you know anything? Were you able to do any research about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to with Reagan's rhetoric, his messaging for these
Mhm.
things, is how he explained it to the American people, and really by de facto the rest of the world, especially the Western alliance, in terms of the theme of good versus evil. Obviously, quite out calling it Star Wars in terms of the good side and the dark side, but he explained how the Soviet system is evil. We call it the evil empire. So if you're going to convince the American people and the rest of the world why we need to do these things, why we actually need to invest in rearmament, why we need to build all these nukes, why we need to do SDI, which of course it didn't exist, but it's going to cost very expensive to try and make it exist. How do we? He had to make the case, and therefore he kind of expose the evils, or what he would say, of the Soviet system. But I think also crucially, another way he did it was through humour. So one thing I like to show my students is Ronald Reagan's Soviet jokes about the one about the plumber. When he says how one day someone went to buy a car, and the guy says, well, the car will be ready in about 10 years time, and so brilliant. And then the seller says, would it be arriving the morning or the afternoon? And the buyer said, well, would it be? It had to be the morning. I said, why? Well, the plumber comes in the afternoon, something like that. So he kind of exposing the silliness and and of course he claimed that these are jokes that the Soviet people kind of tell themselves. Now Reagan, of course, is quite apocryphal, so he tells lots. It's easy. He does tell his lovely stories. In some ways, they're not maybe necessarily all true. Um, it's like a story he tells about Margaret Thatcher when Margaret Thatcher becomes prime minister and he's visited London as a former governor and failed presidential candidate. And someone says to him, "Oh, by Jove, how can we have a woman prime minister?" He said, "Well, you had a woman queen. You had a queen called Victoria, did quite well. So, and that's in his memoir. So, did that really happen? I don't know. So there is lots of kind of like ways he explains stuff. It goes back, I think, to the wisdom, which was Thomas was talking about, where you can actually reach people. And I think it's that storytelling, that rhetorical ability, which is so important, I think, for successful presidents. So you're thinking about, say, Lincoln being a storyteller. Roosevelt, of course, the fireside chats where he makes banking interesting. The first ever fireside chat may explain how the banking system works, which is probably the most boring thing you possibly do, but he makes it interesting. Kennedy tells a story about America. Reagan tells a story about America. Clinton maybe probably less so, but Obama certainly tries to tell us about America. So it is that rhetorical ability that's key for taking people with you, with policies which otherwise would be maybe quite controversial or unpopular.
Can I piggyback a question off of that? Because I actually had one I was going to ask later, but it really plays well into this. I was a child of the 1980s. I grew up under Ronald Reagan. As a kid, I didn't understand a lot about politics, but what I liked about him was his optimism and this glowing pride he had in America. Some may write those things off, as performative or stylistic, but I think they really did matter, not just to kids, but to adults. And I think it helped set this positive national tone and set this message that we were on the rebound after some of the problems in the Carter years, and we were together as a country. How important do you, as a historian, think that optimism and that national pride was to Reagan's legacy?
I think in some ways, it's the legacy of Reagan is two things. One, it's his rhetoric in terms of the role of government, which kind of therefore kind of stops. It's almost like the response to FDR. So they're kind of like the two kind of big policy debate presence. But in terms of the rhetoric, he made Americans feel good about being Americans again. I think that's the most important thing. He did that sense of optimism. So I remember talking when I started my PhD research on Reagan and Thatcher many, many, many years ago, and chatting to a family friend, and he said he never liked Margaret Thatcher, but he liked Ronald Reagan. I remember I said to him, well, if you didn't like Margaret Thatcher, you probably wouldn't have really liked living in Reagan's America. But from the outside looking in, Reagan was seen as a kind of jovial, upbeat, optimistic leader. So I don't think we can really underestimate the value of good communication. And it is that optimism, the rhetoric, the presidential voice, or the bully pulpit was called, Teddy Roosevelt called. I think Kennedy gets it as well. Reagan gets it. That America's complicated. They're always telling students that this 50 states are all very different, and they're in how America works is very complicated. And in some ways, actually, the president, in terms of what the president can do, has less individual power. It may sound bizarre than say the British Prime Minister, because if you're the Prime Minister, you can do whatever you like. You've got the majority in House Commons. But if you're the president and you go divided government, it's very difficult to do stuff. Plus, there's so many things which are for the states, of the federal government, and so on. You've got the courts, and but actually, to manage a country or to take a country with you, it's not maybe policy that matters sometimes. It is rhetoric and the vision and the story that you're telling the American people about where they're going. And is that kind of bouncing back from the 70s of, Watergate, Vietnam, Jimmy Carter, which I think is really what was needed at the time. And I was a child of the 80s. I was playing Transformers and Turtles, the first wave of these things, when all this was happening. So I didn't really know what was going on either. But I think I knew who Reagan was. I knew who Thatcher was. I think George Bush might be my first president I properly remember. It's a bit like your first Doctor Who, like the first person, the one you really remember most. But Bush is my first remember most of George Bush. But so I'm with you, a child of the 80s, and now I'm kind of catching up on what I missed during my playtimes.
Excellent. I'll throw you back to Thomas. Go ahead, Thomas.
So, my understanding is that Reagan kind of put at the forefront the foreign policy, given his role and where he had the most influence, and he was most concerned about the issue of the Soviet Union out of all the things that he was focused on. Would we say it was accurate that there was pushback within his administration of the way he handled the Soviets by calling them an evil empire and all of that, or was there pushback from other elites? What do you want to say something about that? Because nowadays, the current president takes the exact opposite approach to, in my opinion, the exact opposite approach to the problem of Russia than Reagan did. Like, Reagan would call them the evil empire, and he would focus on moral clarity. But the current president is like, we want to have some relationship there, so we, have to be nice to them or something. But it sounds like that approach wasn't uncommon even back in Reagan's time. People like Senator Kennedy kind of had that same approach to Russia, and were there people even in Reagan's administration that challenged him on that?
I think the Reagan foreign policy is just fascinating in terms of how it develops. So when he's asked the question, I think by Martin Allen asked him the question in the kitchen in California when he's running for president for 1918, he says, "What's your strategy for the Cold War?" And he just said, "Well, we win, they lose." And of course, what he does then in 1982, when he goes to London and gives his big speech, the Westminster speech, when he kind of articulates what probably becomes a Reagan doctrine about pushing back, rolling back, and he actually says how actually Marxist-Leninism will be consigned to the actual history, and everyone thinks he's nuts. Because don't forget that at this point, academics, over-elites academics or politicians or anyone thinks that essentially we're stuck in this bipolar world of the first world, second world, and the so-called then third world. But actually, the Soviet Union is here to stay. And even if you look at even Reagan documents, foreign policy, don't ever imagine there not being a Soviet Union. They always think that regime will always exist. It's all about basically beating them or changing the regime slightly or making it more capitalist, that kind of thing. So, but Reagan, they all thought it was nuts. The fact that we could actually win the Cold War would ever actually come to an end. So there's lots of pushback, I suppose, from the elite press and so on, and other people maybe think he's just barking mad. It was a bit like when he gave the speech, the only kind of real time where Thatcher kind of like seemed to wake up apparently during some press reports in the speech was that he mentioned the Falklands or something like that. But it was quite a major speech he gave in Westminster 1982 when he articulates this. But in terms of foreign policy, of course, it changed. He has Alexander Haig, and then he has George Shultz. So in terms of the putting flesh on the skeleton of the foreign policy, Shultz is very important. And of course, Haig is there initially, and they even have Judge Clark as he's the Deputy Secretary of State, basically kind of spy on him, or not spy, but keep tabs on him because Haig's an outside, Haig's a Nixon guy. So Reagan appoints him because Nixon writes him a letter saying, "These are your advice for your administration, for your transition." So Haig gets a job that way. Of course, Haig only lasts about a year or less than a year till he's so he goes sort of in '82, doesn't he? Leaves after the Falklands. So it's kind of like he does change, and he does go through a lot of national security advisors as well, especially in his second term. So in terms of the foreign policy, I think he's that overriding the rhetoric about the evil empire, the overriding sense that actually we need to have strength through peace through strength. That we have to kind of make sure the Soviets come to the bargain table from a position of strength is important. The other pushback, of course, is that the Soviet leaders keep dying on him. So his defense is whenever he's asked a question, why don't you speak to them? So, well, they keep dying. But the biggest kind of pushback in the end, I think, comes in the 83-84 period when he comes to the 1984 presidential election, where Dick Wervlin, his big pollster, says that actually, looking at the data, we need to talk more about peace. So the big emphasis on peace starts to come through. So kind of like strength is in 1980, and basically taking on the Soviets and being tough on the Soviets. When you get to 84, the emphasis goes to peace. And that's probably maybe women voters, other voters, more they're concerned about some of the rhetoric, because there has undoubtedly been some concern across the Atlantic where, in terms of excuse me, basically, for example, he starts putting sanctions on Poland, that kind of thing, and a lot of the Western Europeans aren't very happy about this. So there is kind of pushback about some of the tactics, and the rhetoric seems a bit extreme, a bit nerve-wracking, like he's going to kill us all. But I think there's always that long-term plan or strategy, you could say, of we need to build up the defences so that we can actually, talk and have a better deal or a better outcome to negotiations.
How would you say Margaret Thatcher responded to? I mean, do you think she was a cheerleader for his approach to foreign policy, or what do you say about that?
I think at times, I think the thing is, when it comes to Reagan, Thatcher, and any other world leader, it's when it suits their interests. I think I might, in my work now, I start to suggest that there's no such thing as domestic politics or foreign policy. Often we talk about the domestic politics of foreign policy or something, but I think it's all just politics. So often when Thatcher goes and meets with Reagan, on the agenda is stuff which matters to her domestic interests. So when you have the sanctions put on Poland for about the Siberian and the pipeway from the Soviet Union, and the Reagan administration think the Europeans are nuts to become reliant on Soviet gas, which in some ways, kind of be right. That West Germany wanted to desperate for this, but also, of course, the UK. We had various contracts for the building of the pipeline. So someone called John Brown Engineering, a Scottish company, was very important. Had lots of contracts for building the pipeline, and because of Reagan's sanctions, meant they were going to lose their contract, lose lots of money. And of course, this is not good for Thatcher, especially when you got high unemployment already. So she's basically very happy with the fact that why are you putting sanctions on Poland? So for this gas pipe being built, which affects all of our economic interests, but you're still selling grain to Russia. And he said, well, I made a campaign promise to sell grain. I said, well, that's great. That's great for you in the Midwest, but what about our interests? So quite often there is a bit of kind of to and fro when it comes to domestic interests. Also, when it comes to the Falklands, where Reagan, of course, wasn't convinced about whether, what side to fall down on. He didn't really want there to, when the Argentina invade the Falklands, he writes his diary, basically he's annoyed by it. It's like, it's a pain in the ass. It's a nuisance. Like, what? I don't really want the British to go to war with like these, even though they're nasty guys, this military junta, they're not communists, so they're our allies in South America. So there is that tension over the Falklands as well. But in some ways, in terms of the complications of foreign policy, maybe bring in his allies like Thatcher, but also his staff, is when at Reykjavik, when he meets with Gorbachev. And it's meant to be kind of the pre-meeting meeting. So they're meant to be, in 86, they meet in Reykjavik, and they're trying to essentially establish the agenda for a summit in Washington, D.C. in 1987. And at this meeting, of course, you probably know, but Reagan essentially offers to get rid of all nuclear weapons. Him and Gorbachev come this close to getting rid of the nukes. And the sting in the tail goes back to one of the first questions about SDI, Star Wars. And Gorbachev says he wants SDI to be shared with him now. And Reagan says no, because Reagan can't share SDI because he sees it as his main bargaining chip, but also it doesn't exist, and he can't admit that it doesn't exist. So in the end, these spontaneous talks break down, where they leave the meeting, and Gorbachev says to Reagan, says, "Well, Ron, I'm not sure what else we could have done." And Ron says, "Well, he could have said yes." But Margaret Thatcher gets wind of the fact that Reagan was prepared to get rid of all the nukes, to eliminate nuclear weapons, and she's furious because she's like, "Well, you can get rid of yours, but not get rid of mine." Because the Western Europeans, they view the nukes as essential to stop the Red Army crossing over, because they haven't got the conventional capacity to stop the Red Army. So Thatcher goes over to Camp David to basically tell Reagan off, and really kind of vent her frustration. And the Americans get very frustrated because they want to have a cocktail reception. And the British are saying, no, we don't want to have a cocktail. We want to get straight down to the argument. And they're saying, no, we're hosting this. It's at Camp David. We want the cocktails. Probably because they want a drink to cope with the telling off from Margaret Thatcher. But of course, typical Thatcher kind of tells everybody else off in the room, but rather than Reagan directly. But there's definitely disagreements. But of course, whenever Reagan would then muse about getting rid of nuclear weapons, his own staff would then say, well, Margaret Thatcher will talk to you about that. So his own staff didn't really want him to get rid of nuclear weapons, and neither did Thatcher. So they kind of used the transatlantic, the Anglo-American kind of pushback to say, no, Ron, no, let's not go there again. Remember what happened last time? Margaret Thatcher wasn't very happy. So there is a regular kind of pushback from different people against his vision. I suppose ironically for Reagan, a nuclear-free world, when we think of Reagan as a nuclear warmonger, he actually wants to get rid of the nukes. So yeah, pushback does happen quite a lot.
Okay, so Schultz, would you say that Schultz and Reagan, we say that they probably got along better than his previous was it Secretary of State, right?
Yeah, well, Schultz is I think Schultz has also been kind of been in and out of previous administrations. So he's got some other experience in Republican administration, but obviously he's the guy who's there for 6-7 years. So you know, and very much is kind of the architects, like the details of this. But Haig was never really a Reaganite, and I think that's in some ways the tensions of the Reagan administration, where you know, who are the Reaganites, who aren't the Reaganites. And I think the first term worked so well because you had Jim Baker, of course, the chief of staff. He wasn't a Reaganite; he was a George Bush guy.
Yeah.
But he works with Mike Deaver and Ed Meese, kind of that famous troika. But of course, in the second term, when they go, Meese becomes Attorney General, Baker becomes Treasury Secretary, and you get Donald T. Reagan in as Chief of Staff. That you get more staff turnover as well. So I think, but Schultz, of course, is a guy he stays. So obviously they have more influence, of course, as time because he's there the longest.
You know, I was talking to one of our board members was on the Reagan administration, and I've asked her about this. And she was originally, they called her a Bushie because she was originally a Bush supporter, but she kind of got won over by Reagan while she was in his administration, even though, she got along great with Bush as well. But it sounded to me, based on that, it made me wonder if a bunch of the Bush, including Bush himself, didn't move a little bit towards Reagan because of his, charm and his success. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, they had to. I mean, when Bush, of course, runs, basically runs as a third term for Reagan, effectively, when he runs as president in his own right. And of course, Reagan handily beats Bush in the primaries, really. So I think in some ways, the old Bush group, the Bushites, almost like the last of maybe the old establishment Republicans, and Reagan's very much the final takeover of the Goldwater conservatives. So the idea very much that the New York Times said that basically Goldwater won the election. It just took 16 years to count the votes. So I think it's obviously what with Reagan becoming the president, winning again, crucial was the second term. It kind of really consolidates Reaganism in terms of the Republican Party.
And Reagan and Bush got along. They started getting along very well after Reagan was shot, is my understanding, because Reagan was impressed by his handling of that.
Yeah, because he didn't land in the president's space, did he? It's like a parking space. Never go to your boss's parking space.
Yeah.
So he didn't go there, and I think he was very humble about it. But also, again, with Reagan was shot, of course, it's the Tip O'Neill story as well, which I find fascinating. Where, of course, Reagan really was much closer to death than they really let on at the time. And I think Tip O'Neill was one of the first people to go to his bedside. And apparently, he kind of like knelt down and prayed with him and kissed him on the forehead and said, "God bless you, Mr. President." So, but I don't think you can really imagine that happening today, like a bipartisan coming together at the at the sick bed. I just can't see it happening. So I think that assassination attempt, it also kind of like shows not just how Bush maybe kind of finally starts to consolidate his importance to Reagan, but also
Mhm.
again that what we had at the time where, yes, there was competition, there was rivalry, but there was still that sense of working. There were Americans working towards a bigger picture, a bigger goal.
Yeah, and that's my understanding. When Reagan woke up, that's a true story, right? Where he said, he asked the surgeon if he was a Republican.
Yeah. Yeah, I think before he when he arrived, and he said to Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And then he said, when we were going to operate him, he said, "I hope you're all Republicans." He said, "Well, today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans."
Yeah.
You can't write stuff like you can't you can't shoot it. It's just ever the actor. It's all very like is it George Gipper, isn't it, in Newt Rock? That great performance about it's like one day when the brakes are beating the boys, tell this one's for the Gipper. It's kind of bedside sort of wonderful storytelling. So he still had it 20, 30 years later.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's fantastic. Now, what about what was do you know anything about the relationship between because back then the conservative ecosphere back then, the Reaganite conservative ecosphere had William Buckley and Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and all these people. I know that Reagan was a fan of Friedrich Hayek. When you met him, he told him that he continued because his major was economics at school, and he said he continued his economic education with Hayek. He told Hayek that or whatever. But was Reagan behind some of that pushing people like Friedman and Hayek in the public sphere, or was that just people underneath him that would kind of push that, or how?
Well, I think the biggest influence on Reagan is probably Arthur Laffer and suppliers to economics.
Oh yeah, with the Laffer.
So obviously in terms of 1976 when Reagan's running, he's asked the question, how are you going to balance the books? So I'll cut spending and cut taxes. Basically they had to go hand in hand. Reagan was all for the balanced budget amendment. There's the Constitution. But by the time he gets 1980, it's about I'm not worried about a deficit because I'll cut the taxes. There's so much growth, all these jobs will be happening, and all these new taxes and so on. So I think that's a big kind of what's like the theoretical sort of the framework, which it can kind of, and again that kind of speaks to the optimism of Reagan that it'll all kind of all work out fine. But in terms of freedom and monetarism, that kind of combat inflation using interest rates and different types of money. Of course, Reagan inherits Paul Volcker from Jimmy Carter. So in terms of fiscal policy, Reagan can do stuff in terms of taxing and spending, and he uses the Laffer curve. Or some people, so some again, this divides an administration where some people believe in this, some people don't. Ultimately, I think if you do cut some taxes, revenue does increase, but not for some others. And I think also the margin as well. I think it's quite. I often say to students here, where ironically when our previous government, they cut the top rate of tax from 50p to 50% of the pound to 45% of the pound. We collected more tax from those people, and they're just like, I know it's counterintuitive, but that's kind of how it is.
Well, that's kind of like the difference between Reagan and zombie Reaganism. Is Reagan understood the theory behind it, and he knew when it would possibly work and when it wouldn't. Whereas like zombie Reaganism's like just keep cutting the taxes and don't worry about it.
But of course Reagan, they do bring up the deficit. Deficits do increase because there is less revenue coming in, but also because of the defense spending. And when Reagan's asked by some interviews with my research many years ago, and I used to work in the OMB, and he asked Reagan, said, "Well, Mr. President, you've still got this deficit. It's a bit of a problem." He said, "Well, I've done all the other things, so 9 out of 10 isn't bad." So it's again like the sunny kind of optimism of Reagan, but also ultimately the US could kind of carry that kind of deficit because it's got the dollar. But obviously when you come in today where the deficits are getting completely out of control, and then you have an economic policy which kind of shakes the market so much, like tariffs and so on, and you see, the status quo is rot, and that's where kind of markets move and respond, and what we call guilds and government bonds, and so again it's kind of like that what you call the zombie Reaganism, where we just keep on cutting, but before there comes a point where actually you can't. So,
it was sustainable back then. It's not sustainable anymore.
So obviously Reagan, therefore, he has a say over fiscal policy in terms of taxes, but also he's working the Democrats. So of course, there is this kind of like almost a standoff between in Congress where like Reagan wants to cut the taxes, and the Democrats saying, well, we're not going to cut the spending, and who's going to blink first? So there's that happening. But also in terms of monetary policy, obviously, like where your Friedman ideas would come in, that's happening at the Federal Reserve. So Reagan, of course, kind of inherits that from Carter and Paul Volcker, who of course just loosens the strings, so to speak, in terms of interest rates just in time for the election. So obviously there's some things that Reagan can do, but of course, in terms of like different types of economic policy, Thatcher can do it all. So back in the day, before we had our Bank of England being independent in 1997, our government would set interest rates. So for Margaret Thatcher, she would be setting interest rates and the tax policy as well, so fiscal and monetary policy. So it's a kind of example of the two institutions being a bit different in terms of how we do things.
Now, do you know anything about? You'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, and what kind of asset that John Paul II was for Reagan and trying to take on the Soviets in the Cold War?
Well, I think in terms of John Paul II, what I would call a work of higher journalism. So when I finish off my PhD, get into turning the thesis into a monograph, a few things started to come out Reagan and Thatcher, and they all tend to be written by higher journalists. So one of them examples, John O'Sullivan, who used to work for the National Review, or edit the National Review, and he writes a lot about the importance of the Pope, of John Paul II, as well as Reagan. And it's the President, the Pope, the prominence of the book, and the importance of their relationship. And of course, when you talk about the Cold War and the religious dimension to that, especially in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, having a Polish Pope really matters. Plus, I went to Catholic school, so I remember John Paul II in his heyday as kind of like the groovy Pope. The very charismatic and popular Pope. Can really get the crowds going. So having that kind of that cheerleader for, I suppose, what you could call freedom, Eastern Europe really kind of mattered. It was inspirational for many people.
And what was you'd have to imagine at that time, because you know how in the underground in the Eastern Europe, there in Poland and other places, there would be people, having clandestine trading of like Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom and all that stuff was a very popular book. Then you have to think that Ronald Reagan must have been a pretty popular guy in those circles in Eastern Europe at this time.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't forget, he goes in, was it 87? He says, tear down this wall. Kind of calls out Gorbachev, effectively saying, we seem to be making some progress. But if you're really serious, then let's get rid of the gate. Tear down this wall. And so for the people in Eastern Europe to think, somebody's actually not just saying, ich bin ein Berliner. Like, it's a bit like on Twitter saying, we're sending you thoughts and prayers type thing, But he's actually saying, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of this wall. So that's quite a transformative thing.
And that was a thing that you said that everyone thought he was crazy for even thinking that.
Yeah, that it's possible. But it's looking increasingly like it was possible. It's something said about people smuggling like the road to serfdom. I did my PhD with a chap from Germany who grew up in Eastern Germany, and he told me a story once when he remembered back in the 80s where a friend of his, drew a picture of the Starship Enterprise in class at school, and the teacher confiscated the picture. And that evening, the East German police came around and said, "How do you know about all this? How do you know about Star Trek? It's Western propaganda." And of course, the question is, well, how did the teacher know that it was Star Trek as well? And you would have thought that Star Trek would have been popular in the communist world, and so but there's no money. So in terms of like smuggling all this stuff, we've got the road to serfdom. We also got popular culture, of course, going through during the whole Cold War in terms of radio and TV and that kind of stuff as well, and Star Trek. I'm sure that made a difference too.
Very cool.
If you don't mind me jumping in here with one, Thomas. Here in the United States, there are a lot of people on both sides who like to compare Donald Trump to Ronald Reagan. Those on the right who do it are doing it as a compliment to Trump. Those on the left, not so much. But I really, and I'm sure Thomas will say, but I really struggle with this comparison because aside from them, both having this celebrity background and both having charisma, I see so little common ground there. On policy, especially foreign and economic, they're worlds apart. Their temperaments are very different. Reagan had, his principles and conservative ideology. Trump doesn't have either. I'd even argue that Trump has far more in common with a Bernie Sanders than he does Ronald Reagan. So I'm curious, why do you think people still like to sort of link them together? Is it just sort of wishful thinking on one side and just kind of sour grapes on the other, or is there more to it?
I think the Bernie Sanders point is interesting because I say to our students here that actually in 2016, Sanders and Trump both identified the same problem or the same potential constituency. Basically, you're essentially working class, if you're left behind by globalization and so on. So I think Trump, I think there was like a kernel of truth in what he identified, that you do have this, you do have that, the have-nots does exist. And people do feel ignored by, East Coast, West Coast, and so on. And the change has been happening in, global economy for 20, 30 years. And also the fact that Trump identified that maybe people are quite economically quite liberal, but socially quite conservative as well. So maybe there's something there. But Sanders is also quite populist in terms of, but obviously their solution would have been very different. But in terms of their messaging, what they identified as was similar. In terms of the comparison with Reagan, there's obviously the issue of character, where Reagan again, when he first met world leaders, I think his first G7, he basically said, "Hello, everyone, I'm Ron," because he was the new boy. And Margaret Thatcher had to kind of looked after him a bit and said, "I'm so sorry about, people being mean to you a bit," that kind of thing. So there was that sense of humility about it. Also, because when it comes to Reagan, that he was kind of like that. Reagan and Trump, they're both electoral winners. That they both won 2 terms. So that kind of helps in some ways consolidate their legacy. They're both consequential in terms of things, but they're both also maybe. I think Reagan also he's changed the direction of American politics, the discourse. So often, if you want to be like a great president, you don't want to be a great president because like Lincoln, FDR, and Washington are the great presidents. So Washington obviously inherits it. He has to get it going. Has to keep it to make it go. Lincoln's Civil War, FDR, Depression, World War II. So really, you don't want to be a great president because it means that essentially the brown stuff has hit the fan. You want to be the next tier down. So you want to be like the guy who maybe wins, or maybe hopefully one day woman, who basically wins twice, and you change the direction of America, the discourse and policy, that kind of legacy. And that's what Reagan does. And I think with the Republicans, they never had another Reagan. They never had a party elder. So like conventions, they didn't bring out George W. Bush because of Iraq and so on and the financial crisis. So he was seen to be quite, persona non grata. Whereas the Democrats, they had Bill Clinton. They could bring out Hillary Clinton. Now they've got Barack Obama. So they had their party elders, if you will. Whereas the Republicans never had that. They just almost had the legacy of Reagan and the memory of Reagan. And of course, Reagan in terms of kind of maybe a shape. So obviously mentioned Reagan's biggest legacy. 2 things: probably making Americans feel good about being Americans again. The second thing was about the rhetoric about government. Reagan, of course, he did cut taxes, but also raised some taxes. He also did lots of, did immigration reform and so on. He did, amnesty. So much so students line graphs of immigration figures made a big spike in the mid-80s because of Ronald Reagan. Now, of course, it's almost a bit like how this country, that every generation has their own Elizabeth I, and so how we recreate figures for our own purposes. That in some ways, actually, I've noticed almost like in debates about these things, about when Reagan now, it's talked about how he did the immigration reform. People ask, "Oh no, but he was tricked. He was told if he did that, there would have been some sort of tax cuts or something like that." That's almost like the MAGA lot, kind of like claiming Reagan for themselves. So obviously Reagan can be kind of invented. Also his rhetoric, of course, informs a contract with America and so on. So Reagan's rhetoric and his ideas had that long-term effect on the Republican Party. And of course Trump wants to claim that because they all did. But I think Trump obviously sees himself as more of a singular figure. I mean, Trump sees himself as the best president ever. Like, Lincoln can't match up to him. But there are comparisons in terms of, say, how they communicate. So Reagan, he was a master of radio and television because he was an actor. Trump really gets social media and drama. So for Trump, it's all about ratings and so on. So just like how FDR didn't invent the radio, but became the master of it, and so on. And Reagan didn't invent the radio or TV, but becomes a master, the great communicator. Trump claimed to have invented Twitter, especially now with his current, with his feud with Musk. But he knows how to use it better than any politician ever before. And also, in fact, he creates drama. And kind of, so there are that comparisons of how they use media and how they communicate. But in terms of how maybe they handle foreign affairs, I think it's very different. Obviously, Reagan, big believer in alliances and NATO and that kind of stuff. Trump not. Also in terms of domestic politics, so obviously Reagan had the whole 11th commandment that you will not speak ill of another Republican, and so on. Trump, when he 2015, 2016 gives everyone nicknames and basically bullies his way to the nomination. But again, it's almost, why did that happen? So why did like the Reagan's party get captured by another party? I think just how like Reagan, I suppose, he inherited Goldwater's conservatism and kind of made it his own, and then in terms of adapted and so on by the Bushes and everything. You also then have like, does Trump, has he inherited maybe the Tea Party movement? Has inherited maybe what Rick Santorum was doing in 2008 in terms of the blue collar worker? So he he can see Trump seeing his own openings and and taking it from there. So I don't necessarily think he's a success to Reagan. I think he's like the success of the conservatism which was emerging on the populist right during and after Obama, if that makes sense. They're definitely like comparisons of how they do things, but in terms of actually as people and how they manage things and the messaging and so on. I mean, Reagan wants to tear down a wall. Trump wants to build a wall. Reagan wants to build a tent and build a coalition and of optimism and looks to the future. Trump wants a coalition of people who are basically loyal to him. So there are these important different emphases between the two, which I think is quite a lazy kind of comparison. I mean, you could say Trump is he more like Nixonian in terms of the getting himself into trouble all the time, but I think it's on purpose. I think Trump is just a completely different type of character. A bit like was instead of Eisenhower, like Eisenhower kind of transcended the Republican Party. Interestingly, you saw Reagan as his successor in some ways. But if the Republicans will MAGA exist without Trump, whereas say Reaganism still existed without Reagan.
Yeah, it definitely seems that there's today in the Republican Party of the people that liked Reagan. We've encountered this a lot in conversations with other people who like Reagan. Is like the Reaganites are split between those who really loved the vibes of Reagan and his personality, but those who also liked his principles. And there's a big divide then between those two types of Reaganites. And the ones who also liked his principles tend not to be the biggest fans of the current administration, whereas those who really just like the fact that Reagan could, how charismatic he was, they're the ones that are more likely to transfer over and also like Trump because of, whatever you want to say about Trump, he's entertaining. He is. I mean, if you don't have a strong emotional response to Trump that doesn't allow you to see it, you can acknowledge that he is entertaining. I mean, that's, he's about the ratings and he does do well with ratings.
But that's how he sees the world, ratings.
Yeah.
Because I've been on The Apprentice, you see the drama of it all, and in terms of foreign policy or anything about transactions and deals, kind of what's in it for us, what's in it for me, that type of attitude. So there is that. Yeah, it's not very Reagan.
No, that's right. That's right. He doesn't. Yeah, but I mean, sometimes do you ever? I don't know about you guys. Do you guys ever catch yourself laughing? I mean, you're like, this is how he bails himself out every time. He makes us laugh because you're like, and it's not. I mean, I'm not fooled by it, but I mean, I think there are a lot of people that are willing to overlook a lot if they can get a laugh.
I think it depends. I think it depends on how you tune in Trump, and maybe sometimes your worldview. So I think, for example, when I was watching Inaugural Address, and my wife is American, she was utterly appalled. I mean, most people were like, "What the hell is this?" I mean, you saw the Clintons laughing in the background. It's like, because they just thought it was ridiculous. But some of the things he said is obviously very, very kind of set into certain communities and so on as well, in terms of like gender identity and that kind of stuff as well. So I think some things which he says would be like, he's just absolutely horrific. But other times when he's like doing his own little press conferences, like oh, I never said that. Just completely said, oh, that never happened, or makes a joke about someone. It's like, this is how he does get away with it. He does, and I think the problem is with Trump, you can actually imagine he is probably, he's probably quite charming company, and probably because his business background and TV background, pretty good conversations, he can kind of like reel you in. You can see that people he does kind of suck people into his orbit. and then of course they kind of crash and burn, don't they? So yeah, there is that sense. He seems a bit Teflon. So, but of course he's Teflon because he's got a base who'll love him whatever he does, whatever he says. But I do think also there's a chance now that I think the world maybe people tend to like tune him in differently now. So the first term is like daily tweets. What has he said now? The constant drama of it all. But now I think people are like, well, that's just Donald Trump being a bit crazy. It's when he's something like Greenland, for example. It's like obviously you're not going to invade Greenland.
I hope not.
Probably not going to buy Greenland. But you think, well, maybe he wants to have a base, have some sort of defense thing there or do a deal. But when he talks about like Canada, is he really want to invade? Or is he just kind of like making fun of the Prime Minister? Is he trying to is it more for domestic entertainment because he's getting a rise out of Trudeau? But the problem is, of course, is that you can tune him in that way, but what words matter, as our friends in my university, the English literature tell us, words matter, and that if you keep saying certain things over and over again, at what point you start to believe people, or you start to take people quite seriously. So you can't always just mess around as funny or just kind of like talking crazy for leverage to guess what he really wants to do. Playing his 7D chess, whatever his supporters claim he makes. But words do matter in terms of like stability. Like international relations relies on you want to know what people will do. Financial markets rely on stability and expectations that things will work a certain way. And if you want to be a disruptor, sometimes there is disruption, and that can have real consequences for real people. So yeah, I mean, he's good television, which is probably why I imagine the networks in America probably wanted him to win. Business was good when Donald Trump was president. In some ways, the networks kind of created him, by giving us so much free ad time and so on.
I mean, we have such a short news cycle because of him. And that he uses that to his advantage. He could just move on to the next news cycle, and then people forget what he did the last one. I mean, yesterday, he said to Merz in Germany, he said, "Oh, D-Day, that wasn't a very good day for you guys, was it?" And 20 years ago, the president says that we'd be talking about it for a week at least, right? But people forgot about it like an hour later when he started fighting with Elon Musk on Twitter.
Well, the difference, of course, when in our last election last year, in June, the big D-Day celebration, the big anniversary, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he left early to actually go into a campaign interview with one of our TV networks, and he was slammed by the press and everyone, like, how dare you leave D-Day as you left David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, to basically stand in for him. And Cameron kind of looked more prime ministerial as well, so it did look good for Sunak that way. But there's certain kind of things and topics you got to kind of like just behave, do what's expected of you, because it just, otherwise it's just not good.
It was interesting thing you said about how you connected FDR with radio and Reagan with radio and television, and then Trump with social media, and it almost feels like a little bit of technological determinism there, because the toxicity comes from the medium itself. It almost sounds like, what's his name, Marshall McLuhan or something, that you wonder if Trump is a byproduct of the toxicity of social media on our culture. I don't know, but it makes me wonder when you say that he's succeeded by mastering that medium. And apparently the guy who mastered TV was pretty good guy, Reagan. But maybe the guys who master social media are just not going to be very good. I don't know.
Well, social media is crazy because you can say anything to anyone. You say things on social media you would never say to people's faces or anything like that. And of course,
you should see, James, what Thomas was saying about you on Twitter today, because it was pretty brutal.
I can imagine. I imagine people, my friends liking it. So yeah, we agree. But so maybe like the medium is the message, but it may just reflect that broader where we are. So in terms of, people maybe just aren't as interested in politics and policy, or maybe just people think, we've been failed for so long that people are just going to roll the dice and take a punt. So when I did a public lecture last year with a colleague about the 1976, about presidential elections and that kind of stuff. It's all very timely. And someone asked me the question, why is Trump going to win? Why is he winning? Could he win again? I said, well, also I'll say to the public or to my students, say, you put yourself living in Michigan or somewhere, and there's lead in your water. Your grandfather used to have a union job in a car factory, and had a decent lifestyle. You needed one income for for the household, vacation a couple of weeks of the year. The schools are all right. There was affordable student loans, or you need a student loan. There were jobs, so on. And now put yourself. That was your grandfather's grandmother's generation, and now you're living like some of the. I don't mean to pick up Michigan, apologies to the Michiganians, but if you're living in a part of the country where there are no jobs, you're working for say a Walmart, which you may not get enough hours in to qualify for their benefits. So if you're reliant on Medicaid, which a lot of American health insurance is just insurance. I mean, the students think that Obama kind of basically brought like a national health service to America. It's like, oh no, it's basically just did extended insurance, a private market, that you still might be out of pocket 20, 30 grand. So you can imagine that you've got, you're worse off than your parents are. You're in a job not what you wanted. You've got crap services, or the water, lead in the water, all this kind of stuff. And you've had Democrats say the same thing to you over and over again about education, important, new jobs, new opportunities. And then you had the Bush administration, where big financial crisis, and you probably maybe lost your house or something like that. You're a 401k. You kind of roll the dice. So it's like, I think I saw, was it a polling which showed that 1 in 30 of people voted for Obama also looked at Trump, like the change voters, like basically well, we just want to vote for someone who's going to just shake things up or do things different. So if you're Donald Trump, you're going to stand in front of a rusted, old, broken out factory and say, I'm going to bring the jobs back. It's like, that's what they want to hear. And even though those jobs aren't coming, and even if manufacturing does come back, it'll be done by AI. It'll be a factory full of robots. So it's that kind of simple kind of solution. But also, I think it's easy to forget how upset a lot of fed up people are in terms of being sold one thing and then nothing happening. Like just over in this country here, where we have the Reform Party surge with Nigel Farage in the opinion polls. And a big driver of that is because, basically politicians of all stripes said, we're going to reduce immigration. And it didn't. It ballooned. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. There's lots of benefits to immigration, but it's like, if you keep saying you're going to do something, then you don't do it. Or if you say we can improve our hospitals and your schools and everything, and they don't get better, or if people are getting more worse off, we shouldn't be surprised if people say, well, actually, you lot got us into the mess. We don't really trust you anymore to get out of it. I think that's the challenge, I think, to the old parts in either the US or the UK or anywhere, is that you have to make the case. If you have to improve people's living standards, and also people do get fed up. And that's why they went for Trump, and especially say the Democratic Party. I think so. You get to students and people. It's like, if the Democratic Party, right or wrong, they're tagged if they only care about a few issues like cultural issues, and don't care about jobs, and so on. Can we be that surprised if people then sort of kind of plump for the guy they think, oh well, when he was president, the economy was going all right until COVID. Now maybe the economy's going right for some people, not everybody, but it's. I think it seems a lot kind of mainstream. People in the centre of politics, they've been seen to have failed fairly unfairly, and that's why people go for Trump. That's why he's forgiven. I think they just see him as he's their guy. He's their guy. He's like the Molotov cocktail, chuck into the system that's failed you. And I think there's that kind of deep underlying anger, which somehow has to be addressed somehow. And maybe then perhaps Trump won't be so Teflon, and maybe won't be able to get away with things with a tweet or something like that.
Yeah, we're definitely dealing with politics of resentment as a major issue, and there were some high-profile failures of establishment in the expert class that we're still recovering from. Most recently with COVID, but also there's a lot of misinformation out there too. Education is going to have to be a big part of any sort of renewal. People just getting understanding the whole story a little bit better, and like for instance, we were talking to a budget guy. There's no way to fix the fiscal issues in the United States without reforming entitlements.
Mhm.
Zero way. All the budget experts know this, but you got to actually convince the people that that's the case. They don't realize that that's the case.
But also as well, it's
Um,
if Trump, on about withdrawing America the defense umbrella from
mhm,
Europe, so
yeah.
therefore maybe but that reduction, there won't be a reduction in defense spending, which will then be in turn could be funneled into entitlements or paying off debt.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a complete mess, really.
Yeah,
There is,
yeah.
I mean,
I'm worried about bigger defense spending
yeah,
in the future
yeah,
if we gets us into a major war because
yeah,
we've torn down all our alliances and everything.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, no, that's no, but these are real issues. That's right. That's 100% right. So I guess John, do you have any other last questions about Reagan? Just
Yeah, well, I think one thing kind of plugs into this discussion we just had. I think so much too, which makes us different. We're much more of a meme culture right now.
Mhm,
You know, back in Reagan's era in the 1980s, I think there was a real hunger for news and information, but people weren't getting it in these huge doses. You know, everybody would turn into the evening news. Those shows did huge ratings. It was like there was, all this information out there that people were sort of hungry for. And I think right, now all these years later, it's people again, it's about emotions, it's about latching on to memes. Social media makes this environment possible where, I see my, friends out on Facebook all day just posting one meme after another, some political thing, and 9 out of 10 times it's not even factually correct what they're putting out there. And I think Trump really, you know, he really does well with memes. He'll latch on to some popular narrative, something that resonates, and he goes from there. But going back to Reagan, no, I think this was actually a really good episode, James. You kind of you've done your homework on the man for sure in the era in American history. Is there anything you wanted to add? I know we're running a little long here, so I don't know if there was anything you wanted to throw in there at the end, Thomas.
oh no, I guess one last question. Uh, what lessons, if you were going to teach a class on statesmanship, to yeah, what lessons would you give to potential future leaders, civic leaders, that you think that they should, if you had to identify two or three things from Reagan that you think that they really need to learn from Reagan, what would they be?
I think humour. I think being humour,
Hmm.
basically being funny and actually seeing the funny side of things.
Hmm.
Um, so that ability to tell that story in that way. I think also not everything's so personal these days.
Hmm.
It's almost like nowadays. It was like, well, it's an example. I think Donald Trump could come out and say, I've had a means to solve climate change." In his big brain, he solved climate change. Him and Elon Musk are friends again, and they're going to get rid of all the CO2, and we're all going to be fine. I guarantee the majority of people in Europe are still hating. Because Donald Trump has said it. If Obama had said it, it'd be like, he's like, really a Superman. What a guy. So I think there is a lot kind of person. I think you kind of got to tone things down. People can't take things so personally, and I think that comes from the leaders. Then you can't take things so personally. They're ultimately not about you. It's about the country. It's about the mission. It's about what you're trying to achieve. And also, if you want to have a legacy, it's about the party. It's about as far as the country. If you want to change direction of something, you need to basically make sure that you should win. You got to win. Winning's important. Kind of how you win. But it's also kind of like remember people who as my dad always said, remember people on your way up because you might remember them on the way down. You need to actually be nice to people, be polite and civil. You don't have to be angry about it. You can just disagree, and
Hmm.
that's absolutely fine. But also, tell the truth. It's just so much easier to tell the truth. Say what you
Hmm.
actually think, rather than to just kind of lie and then say one thing or another and get yourself all caught. Just tell the truth, say what you think, and then ultimately the people will make their decision, won't they? If they like it or not.
Hmm.
Great advice for sure, and that's good advice from your dad as well.
Yeah,
James, thank you so much for coming on the Reagan Caucus podcast. This was really fun. We'd love to talk to you again sometime if it's something you're open to. But we
yeah, absolutely.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent. And I want to just thank everybody for tuning in today and watching this or listening to this. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like the video and subscribe to our channel. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or something of that nature, make sure you like and subscribe as well. And we will see you next time, everyone, on the Reagan Caucus Podcast.